Deep in the Idaho wilderness, a group of young hikers stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. However, they had no idea that something had made its nest inside. You won't want to miss this one. On the evening of June 29th, 2018, Taylor Ross and his three friends had just parked their car near an old hiking trail deep in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. Taylor and his friends were all students at Boise State, and they'd driven out here because they'd heard about this really remote hiking spot that supposedly had incredible views of the valley. None of them had ever been to this part of Idaho before. The four of them grabbed their backpacks from the trunk and started heading down this narrow dirt path that vanished into the trees. Right away, Taylor noticed how quiet it was out here. There weren't any other cars in the small gravel lot where they'd parked, and they couldn't hear any sounds of civilization. As they walked deeper, the trees got thicker and the path got harder to follow. They had to use their phones as flashlights because the tree cover was so dense that barely any light was getting through. And it was getting colder too. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since they'd left their car. Taylor's friend Michael kept checking his phone's GPS, but they hadn't had any signal for the last 30 minutes. The hiking app they'd been using to navigate had stopped working minutes after they left the car, but they figured they couldn't really get lost if they just stayed on the path. The group had planned to hike up to this lookout point that was supposed to be about 2 miles from the parking area. But after walking for what felt like way longer than it should have taken, Taylor started to wonder if maybe they'd missed a turn somewhere. Now, one thing that really began to bother Taylor was just the complete lack of wildlife present. I mean, this is the woods for crying out loud, and there weren't any birds or squirrels or anything. Now, I know this was technically in the evening time, but still. And at one point, the path in front of them was extremely overgrown, and so they decided to cut through into this small game trail that was on their right-hand side. And here, one of Taylor's friends mentioned that they should explore this game trail and that it might lead them to a neat camping spot off the beaten path. The group agreed to take this and began to make their way through the dense brush. And this brush was so thick that Taylor had to push his hands and just try to get all the brush out of his face. And his backpack kept getting caught on thorns, and the ground was getting mushier with each step. At the time, Michael was leading the group, and at some point, he stopped suddenly, causing everyone behind him to bump into each other. And so Taylor asked him what was wrong, but he told the group to listen. And for a moment, everybody just stood there in silence. But there was nothing to hear. There was just this heavy silence that just pressed down on them. Even their footsteps in the mud seemed muffled. Now, the sun was getting lower now, and the forest was getting darker by the minute. So Taylor pulled out his phone to check the time, but his battery had dropped to 15%, even though it had been fully charged when they left the car. But they just continued pushing for another 10 minutes until the game trail opened up into this rather small clearing. It was maybe 50 feet across and perfectly circular, like somebody had intentionally cut down all the trees here. And the weird thing was, there wasn't any undergrowth here. It was just all bare dirt. Michael pointed out that this would actually make a pretty decent camping spot and suggested maybe they should mark it on their phones for next time. But Taylor wasn't really listening anymore. He was looking at something on the other side of the clearing that just didn't seem right. Through the growing darkness, Taylor could just barely make out what looked like the edge of a structure tucked into the tree line on the far side of the clearing. He thought it maybe was just a weird formation of rocks or fallen trees, but his eyes adjusted more, and he could see the distinct shape of a roof. So Taylor pointed this out to his friends, and they all just kind of stood there squinting through the darkness, trying to figure out what they were looking at. Now, one of Taylor's friends pulled out their phone and shined the flashlight towards the structure, and sure enough, there was this old log cabin just sitting there. It looked like it had been there for quite a while. I mean, the logs were dark with age and covered in moss, and there was a small window on either side of what must have been the front door. but Taylor couldn't really see inside because the glass was so dirty. The roof was partially caved in on the back corner, and Michael started walking towards the cabin, saying how cool it was they'd found this place. But Taylor just wasn't feeling right about the whole thing. I mean, even up to the cabin, there was no walkway, there wasn't a cleared area. It was like this cabin had just been dumped right here in the middle of nowhere. And as they got closer, Taylor could see that somebody had nailed boards across the front door in an X pattern, but some of the boards had rotted through it and fallen away. And there were also deep scratches in the wood around the door frame, like something had been trying to get in or maybe get out. The group gathered around the front door, and Michael reached and gave it a push, and the door, kind of creaked open about halfway before getting stuck on the warped floorboards inside. And instantly, this blast of stale, musty air just hit them, and Taylor caught a whiff of something else. Something that smelt like wet dog and rotting meat. And they were able to kind of squeeze through the gap at first, with the others following. And at this point, the overwhelming stench of blood hit them. And it was so bad that Taylor's friends gagged and covered their mouths with their sleeves. And they would kind of sweep their flashlights across the cabin, but there were animal carcasses everywhere. There was a half-eaten deer propped up against one wall, its ribcage torn open. Scattered across the floor were the bones of smaller animals like rabbits, foxes, maybe even a coyote. And all the bones had these deep scoring marks on them, like something had been gnawing on them. There was also a metal bed frame that was pushed up against the wall at this weird angle, like something had shoved it aside to make room for its own sleeping area. There were also deep claw marks in the wooden walls, and some of them head height on a tall person. It was evident that whatever was living here was big enough to reach up that high. Now, in the far corner of the cabin, Taylor's light fell on a trapdoor, and it was kind of propped open at an angle, and it had kind of rusty hinges barely holding it in place. It looked like it had been part of the original cabin, maybe a door that led to an old root cellar or storage space. And there was kind of this like weird metallic smell coming from it. As Taylor approached and got closer, he could also kind of hear the strange humming drifting up from below. At this point, they all began to get a really bad feeling about being here, like there was just something really wrong. And so Mike begins to try to get Taylor's attention that they should leave right now. But when that was going on, Taylor was kind of shining his light around, just sweeping it around the cabin, and his light caught something big moving below them through the floorboards, just this large shape moving towards the open door in the floor. And then came this rumbling sound that kind of seemed to vibrate the entire cabin. And all of a sudden, the trapdoor suddenly burst upward, splintering apart as this massive dark shape exploded out of the hole. And these two yellow eyes just locked onto them. And in all the chaos and the frantic flinging of their flashlights, they could see rows of yellow teeth and a face that looked warped and distorted. Taylor's friend screamed, dropped his phone, plunging that side of the cabin into darkness. And the shape was moving fast, way too fast, and was making these horrible sounds. Now, Mike was pretty much the first to react. He yelled for everyone to get out and shoved the person nearest to him toward the door. Taylor felt something rush past him in the darkness, something big enough to make the floorboards creak and just groan under their weight. Everybody was scrambling for the door, and then someone, bam, slammed into him from behind, knocking him into the wall, and he could hear these growling sounds getting closer to him. The door was still only halfway open from when they'd first entered. Now, 4 people were trying to squeeze through it at once, and so Taylor got pushed up against the door frame so hard he felt splinters dig into his arms, and he could feel this hot breath on his neck. And they burst out of the cabin and into the clearing, and nobody stopped running. They just crashed through the brush, the branches, all whipping their faces, and Taylor could hear whatever it was crashing through the woods behind them, but he didn't look back. They all just ran, and nobody was really following the game trail anymore. They were just running straight through the forest. trying to get as far away from that cabin as possible. Taylor's lungs were burning and his legs felt like they were on fire, but the sound of something big moving through the woods behind them kept them going. And Mike was yelling about something getting back to the main trail, but Taylor couldn't tell which direction that even was anymore. It was just complete chaos at this point, and it was almost completely dark. The only light came from one phone that somebody was still holding as they ran, because the rest had been dropped back in the cabin through all the chaos. Taylor's foot caught on a root and he went down hard. Now he scrambled to get back up, his hands were shaking in the cold mud, and so one of his friends grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet, and at this point they could hear the crashing sound getting closer from behind. They all burst through a thick patch of trees, and suddenly it looked like they were back on the main trail. Taylor recognized the bent tree they'd passed earlier. Mike was screaming at everyone to turn left, that the parking lot was that way, but they could hear whatever was chasing them breaking through the tree line behind. And so they began sprinting up the trail, their feet wet and slipping on the ground, and Taylor's chest felt like it was going to explode. He could barely see where he was going, and the only thing keeping him moving was the sound of these heavy thuds coming from behind him, and he couldn't tell if they belonged to his friends or something else. Now, the trail suddenly forked in a way Taylor didn't remember from earlier. Michael took the right path without even hesitating, but about 30 seconds of running, the trail just dead-ended at a cliff face. They'd clearly gone the wrong way, and so they all turned around to backtrack, but now they could feel something strange. It was like this vibration coming up to the soles of his shoes. The whole ground seemed to be humming. One of his friends stopped and said that something felt weird, like static electricity was making all their hair stand on end. And the vibration got stronger, and Taylor could hear this low rumbling sound coming from somewhere beneath them, and it didn't sound like it was anything natural. It was mechanical, like machinery, but deeper. They're very aware that this large bear or predator is trying to come after them, and so Michael's whispering to them that they need to be quiet. And so they all just kind of stood there, barely breathing, listening to the weird humming that was moving up through the earth, while also trying to keep track of where they were and what was happening. And Taylor could feel pins and needles in his legs, like, when your foot falls asleep, except it was spreading up through his whole body. The rumbling began to get louder, and now Taylor could actually feel heat coming from the ground. Now, the one working flashlight they had left started pulsating, just getting brighter and dimmer, like it was breathing. And that's when they heard the crashing in the woods again, but coming from behind them. Whatever had chased them out of the cabin was still there, and they were now trapped between the cliff face and the strange animal that they don't know what it was they were dealing with. And they're all panicking because they don't know what they're going to do or how they're going to get out of the situation. They're convinced they're going to die. And so Michael's quickly looking around, trying to think, and he spots a narrow gap between two boulders that looked like it might lead them back to the main trail. They had no choice. The crashing sounds were now getting closer, and that weird electrical humming was making them all feel nauseous. And so, quickly thinking, they all squeezed through the gap, single file, the rocks scraping against their backpacks, and the ground under their feet was hot, like they were walking on a giant heating pad. Their one working phone started going crazy. The screen was just flashing random patterns, and then it would just die completely. They now emerged on what looked like the main trail, but everything looked different in complete darkness. And at this point, Taylor could feel his entire body buzzing like he was touching an electric fence. And all of a sudden, they could hear their car alarm going off in the distance. Through the trees, they could see the parking lot lights, and they knew they weren't far, but the sound also told them something else. That whatever animal had chased them this far, it had now circled around ahead of them. And of course, they were all frozen, because the crashing sounds were now coming from two directions, behind them and up ahead near their car. The rumbling under their feet suddenly stopped, but the air felt charged like right before a lightning storm. Not really knowing how to process the situation and all of these imminent signs of danger around them, Michael just grabbed Taylor's arm, pointed to a drainage ditch that ran alongside the trail, and realized it was their only option. They'd have to use it for cover to try and make it to the car. And they could hear something really big moving through the trees on both sides of them now, and it sounded like it was trying to box them in. Now, the drainage ditch was about 4 feet deep, just enough to stay low while running. So they all crouched down and started moving as fast as they could toward the parking lot. Taylor could hear these footsteps almost pacing them on both sides of the ditch, and every few seconds they'd catch glimpses of something massive moving through the trees. Whatever it wasn't a typical bear or a wolf or a coyote. This thing was walking on 2 legs, and Taylor could just hear this deep, raspy breathing. It sounded like it was human, but not quite. And they were getting pretty close now. They were about 50 yards from the car, and Mike just whispered for everybody to stop. Up ahead, illuminated by the parking lot lights, was this huge figure that was clearly standing upright, easily 8 feet tall, and what they were looking at, folks, made all of their blood run cold. What they were seeing had the head of a wolf, but its eyes appeared intelligent, like a human, and it was standing right next to their car like it was waiting for them. The car alarm was still blaring, and in the flashing lights, Taylor was able to see its muscles rippling under its thick dark fur, and its hands, not paws but actual hands with opposable thumbs, were resting on the hood of their vehicle. Michael pulled something from his pocket, his car keys. He hits the panic button, and all the lights in the car start flashing even brighter. And now this thing turned its head toward the sudden change in lights, and that's when Michael screamed, "Run!" And they just exploded out of the ditch and sprinted for the car. This thing let out this sound that was halfway between a roar and a human scream, and Taylor could hear its claws scraping across the hood of the car as it began to lunge toward them. Michael was already hitting the unlock button. They reached the car just as this thing closed the distance, and Taylor felt something sharp graze his back as he dove into the back seat. The doors slammed shut right as this massive furry arm reached through the window gap trying to grab them. Mike jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as this thing slammed its whole body against the driver's side, causing the car to rock violently. And through the window, Taylor was now face to face with it. Its eyes weren't just intelligent, they were glowing this weird yellowish green color, and he could see saliva and what looked like bits of torn, devoured flesh between its yellow, disgusting, sharp teeth. All the while, the tire spun in the gravel as Michael floored it, and this thing held onto the car for a few seconds before it just finally let go. In the rearview mirror, they could all just see it standing in the middle of the parking lot watching them leave, because it wasn't chasing them anymore, it was just watching. And nobody said a word for the first 20 minutes of the drive back to Boise. They were all just trying to process what just happened. But it wasn't until they got cell service again that Taylor called his brother, who had hunted out in the same region many times and had some very bizarre experiences of his own. As it turns out, his brother had multiple sightings of an upright canine creature in the Sawtooth Mountains. He even had trail cam photos that looked exactly like what they'd seen. Apparently, his brother was so scared about his experiences that he didn't tell anyone because he was convinced nobody would believe him. Taylor's brother sent him a link to this private Facebook group for hunters in the Sawtooth region, and after scrolling through the posts, Taylor realized their encounter wasn't some freak incident, because over the past 5 years alone, there had been dozens of similar sightings in that exact area. The thing was, when people would write in their posts that they had reached out to Fish and Game about this, their post would soon be deleted within just a matter of days. And interestingly, there was one hiker in particular from about 3 months prior to this incident that had a very similar experience, and that they talked about these strange electrical sensations and underground vibrations. Now, supposedly, the Department of Energy had built some kind of research facility in the Sawtooth Mountains back in the 1980s, but the public has never been made aware of any sort of research that they'd been doing. 2 days after their experience, Taylor drove past the turnoff to that hiking trail, and there was now a brand new gate across the entrance with signs saying the area was closed for environmental studies. There were also fresh tire tracks leading up to the gate that looked to be from large vehicles, perhaps military vehicles. Now, to this day, Taylor prefers not to talk about his experiences for fear of ridicule and only confides in those he trusts. The strange, upright canine they encountered that evening remains unknown. On a hot afternoon in August of 2017, Scott Yeoman stood in the driveway of his new house on the outskirts of Bailey, Colorado, unloading renovation supplies from his truck. He and his wife had just bought this house a few weeks earlier, and they'd been spending pretty much every day fixing it up. The house needed a lot of work. The previous owners hadn't done any maintenance for years, and it really showed. The walls needed fresh paint, the floors needed refinishing, and there were dozens of small repairs that needed attention. Scott grabbed another box of supplies and headed towards the front door. He and his wife were working on the back portion of the home. They'd already repainted most of the front rooms, and now they were slowly making their way toward the back of the property. At this point, the August heat was brutal. Scott could feel sweat running down his back as he carried the supplies inside, and he'd already made several trips back and forth from his truck. He still had more materials to bring in, and so Scott walked to the front door and started making his way through the living room. And he was thinking about all the work they still needed to do in this section of the home. The baseboards needed to be replaced, and there was this one creaky floorboard that kept driving him nuts. But suddenly, Scott stopped dead in his tracks. There was this horrible smell coming from somewhere in the room. He thought that something had died in the walls because that wouldn't be unusual. And so he stood there trying to figure out where this awful smell was coming from, because it wasn't just a normal dead animal smell. I mean, this was really pungent, like rotting flesh and vomit and animal feces all combined into one. It was so bad. And he's walking around the room, checking the corners and the walls and just trying to find the source. Maybe there was a dead raccoon in the crawl space. But the smell seemed to be everywhere at once. And so Scott went to open one of the living room windows to try to get some fresh air flowing, and the window was stuck, of course, probably from years of paint buildup. And he had to really push against the frame to get it to budge. And as he was struggling with the window, something caught his eye outside. It was just a quick flash of movement at the edge of his vision. I mean, it was so fast, he wasn't even sure he'd really seen anything. He stopped messing with the window and just stood completely still. Now, the woods behind their house were dense, and it wasn't unusual to see wildlife. I mean, they'd already spotted deer, foxes, and even a few bears since buying this place. Now, he stayed at the window for a moment, scanning the tree line, expecting to see a bear or maybe a deer moving through the brush, but the woods were just still. Not even the branches were moving. And Scott was about to go back to working on the window when that horrible smell suddenly got much stronger. It was so intense now that he could practically taste it. And that's when he heard something moving just outside. So Scott turns and froze, because standing there just on the other side of the window was something he couldn't explain. At first, his brain tried to make sense of it by telling him it was a bear, but this thing was like nothing they'd ever seen. It was massive, and the way it was standing, the way it was moving, it wasn't like an animal. Now, luckily, Scott happened to have his cheap Kodak camera with him, and he'd been using it earlier to document some of the renovation work. And without taking his eyes off of this thing, he slowly raised his camera and snapped several photographs. The entire time, this thing was just standing there, looking right back at him, and he knew he needed to get his gun. He had stored it in another room for protection since they were so far in the woods. Scott backed away from the window as carefully as he could because he didn't want to make any sudden movements, and he kept his eyes locked on this animal until he reached the hallway. Once he was out of sight, he ran to get his gun, and the whole time he's thinking about how this can't be real, how could this be happening? But when he got back to the living room with his gun, it was still there. But something had changed. It was like this thing could sense danger. And as soon as he came back with the gun in hand, it began to move away from the window. And within seconds, it disappeared into the night. He just stood there for a moment with his gun still pointed at the window. His heart was racing so fast he couldn't hear anything else. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew he needed to call someone. So he pulled out his phone, called the police, and as you can imagine, he tried to keep his voice steady as he explained what had just happened. But he could tell the dispatcher didn't really believe him. She just kept asking him if what he saw was a bear, and he wasn't sure. Well, 3 officers would eventually show up at his house, and he led them through the property and showed them where this thing had been standing outside. And of course, the officers, they walked around the perimeter. They looked for any tracks or evidence, but they couldn't really find much. Now, Scott pulled out his camera and showed them the photos he'd taken. 2 of the officers just stared at the camera screen and they were amazed by what they were seeing. But the 3rd officer, he just shook his head and insisted that it had to be a bear. The officers spent about an hour searching everything and they wrote up their official report, concluding that Scott had probably just seen a large black bear. After the police had left, Scott went back inside, downloaded the photos from his camera onto his computer, and then something happened that was extremely bizarre. A fire broke out in the home, and the fire ended up destroying his computer with the video footage on it. The only evidence that survived were the photographs he'd taken with his Kodak camera. And for the longest time, he didn't tell anybody about what happened that day. Not his friends, not his family, nobody. And he kept those photos hidden for several years because he was afraid people would think he was just crazy if he showed them. Well, finally, in 2020, Scott decided that it was time to share his story. He felt like maybe somebody out there had seen something similar and maybe his photos could help other people who had their own unexplainable encounters. Scott posted them online and he explained that there was a story behind them. He told people about that evening in August, about the smell, about the creature, and he said that he hoped people would find something useful if they ever came across something similar. These photos that Scott took are now considered some of the best pieces of Bigfoot evidence ever captured in Colorado. Others claim that they're just a bear, but look at them. That doesn't really look like a black bear to me. But there are others that insist that this doesn't show a Bigfoot, but rather something science can't explain. Now, to this day, whatever animal it was watching Scott through the window remains unknown. And because you guys made it this far, I want you all to comment below cabin fever. And if you guys enjoy cinematic storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.